Dear guests, I'm angry. We should all be angry. Anger has a long history of bringing about change. I quote our keynote speaker today from her book, We Should All Be Feminists. Several years before the Me Too movement flooded the world with its stories, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie had spoken of the power of many stories. I found in her idea of a regained paradise a powerful image of solidarity. The regained paradise is people being told and reading stories about their own history, their own stories in a way. She tells our stories wherever she may anchor them, in Nigeria or America or anywhere else. They are stories of our common humanity. On behalf of the International Reykjavík Literary Festival and the University of Iceland's co-hosts of this event, RIKK Institute for Gender, Equality and Difference and the GRÓ-GEST program, I warmly welcome you to this event. We are delighted and honored to host Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie this afternoon. I assume that you are all well informed about her work, so I promise I will keep this introduction short. Chimamanda Adichie is one of the most influential contemporary literary voices in the world today, having written novels, short stories, and plays that have had a great impact and have received wide critical acclaim. Her first two novels are set in Nigeria: Purple Hibiscus, published in 2003, winner of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and her international bestseller, Half of a Yellow Sun, published in 2006, winner of the Orange Prize, and published in Icelandic 2 years later. Her short story collection, The Thing Around Your Neck, published in 2009, has now been translated into Icelandic, as I mentioned earlier. Her 2013 novel, Americana, that tells the story of a young Nigerian woman in the United States, won the US National Book Critics Circle Award. Her non-fiction includes We Should All Be Feminists, published in 2014, and Der Vele, or a Feminist Manifesto in 15 Suggestions, published in 2017, on how to empower a daughter to become a feminist. Her most recent book came out a few months ago, Notes on Grief, on the loss of her father. Her work has been translated into over 30 languages. Let me note that there will be questions and answers session after Adichie's talk with 7 panelists, students at the University of Iceland. Let me also mention, before we welcome our speaker, that in accordance with the COVID regulation here in Iceland, the audience is required to wear masks throughout the event. So, Adichie is here today to discuss the pursuit of joy, storytelling, feminism, and changing one's mind. So without a further ado, please welcome warmly Chimamanda Adichie to the stage.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And thank you for being here. I'm very happy to be here, my first time in Iceland, and I want to start with a confession. You might know that I gave a talk called The Danger of a Single Story, and one of the ways in which I have survived the lockdown period is by consuming a lot of Scandinavian thrillers on Netflix. And after I exhausted the Norwegian and Swedish and Danish ones, I then moved to the Icelandic ones. And so I fell in love with Trapped. And I was kind of disappointed when I got to Reykjavík and it wasn't like Trapped. So this is my confession on my single story of Iceland. And I beg your forgiveness. So I've called this talk The Pursuit of Joy, because in the past few months, having experienced terrible and very painful losses, I've been thinking a lot about what life means and about what life should mean. I remember a European friend of mine, and I will not name the country from which this friend came, once saying with an eye roll and with that mix of resentful admiration that some European intellectuals have for America, how typically American to have the pursuit of happiness as part of a constitution. Who pursues happiness? And I remember thinking, I do. Don't we all? America may be the only country in which the pursuit of happiness is an enshrined constitutional right, but it seems to me that this, in fact, is the central point of being alive as human beings. We want meaning and we want love, but these ultimately are about joy. We are all in pursuit of joy. How we go about obtaining this happiness, and indeed what counts as happiness to us, will differ from person to person, of course. But to be alive, to be human, is perhaps always to be in pursuit of joy. Throughout the course of our lives, many things constitute obstacles to this quest for joy. Accidents of birth, for example. To be born into a deprived part of the world automatically creates more obstacles to your pursuit of joy. Our personality traits, the class we are born into, the race, the religion. For women, the fact that they are women is very often a large obstacle in their human pursuit of joy. And this is how I like to think of sexism now, that which comes in the way of a woman's pursuit of joy. Of course, it's really about the social and political and cultural and economic obstacles that women face because they are women. But I think of it as obstacles to joy because I increasingly think that while we must change laws that diminish women in different parts of the world, changing mindsets is even more important. We should enact formal policies that support women, but changing cultural attitudes is even more important. And one way to go about changing mindsets and cultural attitudes is through storytelling. Why does it matter that we focus on storytelling? The point is what I will call maximum joy, to create the greatest possible opportunities for joy for the greatest possible number of people in the world. And it brings to mind a line I love by the poet Mary Oliver. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? It is storytelling that illuminates the automatic cultural assumptions that we have. And because automatic cultural assumptions are often from culture, and because we human beings made culture, we can then go about the thorny and complicated and necessary process of unmaking culture. I am a fiction writer, a teller of stories. Literature is my one true love. Literature is my religion. It is literature that shapes the lenses with which I look at the world. Human stories sustain me. I read stories for consolation. I read to feel less alone. I read in the pursuit of knowledge, and I read simply to know. And I have come to believe deeply in the power of storytelling, because it is storytelling that enables real human empathy and real human connection. It is storytelling that creates truth and beauty. And what is life without truth and beauty? A barren exercise. By beauty, I mean all of those things that occasion in us human beings feelings of appreciation and pleasure and gratitude. And by truth, I'm not quite sure what I mean by truth, but I can tell you that I make a distinction between fact and truth. And I can tell you that truth has a certain emotional resonance, a certain emotional heft that fact does not. I knew the basic facts of Nigerian history when I first read the great novels of Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart and Arrow of God. But it was those novels that made me realize that while I may very well know the facts, I did not really know the truths. I knew facts like pacification and amalgamation and indirect rule. But the truths were in the human stories. The story of a respected man being flogged publicly by agents of the British colonial government. The story of an Igbo priest, once resplendent in his pride and his stubbornness, now reduced to sitting on a cold prison floor because he had dared to reject an offer from a British district officer. And in images such as these, I learned a great truth which the history books said nothing about: the loss of dignity. The loss of dignity illuminates so much about Nigerian history and about our present, about our social psychology and about our politics. And still on the subject of Chinua Achebe, in his essay titled Traveling White, he tells a story about a German judge. This distinguished judge, a president of the highest constitutional court in Germany, had just accepted an offer to move to Namibia and become a consultant to the Namibian regime. Then a friend of the judge gave him the novel Things Fall Apart. And after he read it, he promptly and dramatically changed his mind. He would no longer move to Namibia because he could not lend his great abilities to an apartheid system that dehumanized Africans. Chinua Achebe concludes the story by wondering why a man so accomplished needed a novel to make him see this. Did he not read the newspapers? But my sense is that the judge knew only the facts of African history. And in reading Achebe's novel, he was able to see the truths. And it was this truth that propelled him to act. Storytelling constantly reminds us that we are not a collection of logical bones and flesh. We are emotional beings. Dignity and love matter as much as bread and water. And so we celebrate France of La Belle Époque, not for the Dreyfus Affair, but for Proust. We do not celebrate Renaissance Italy for its many endless, pointless wars. We celebrate it for Palestrina and Da Vinci. And while we keep Germany's evils of the Second World War always in sight, it is Goethe and Heine that are its redeemers. I don't know if some of you know that I'm considered something of a feminist. I'm not sure why that is, no. I'm often asked what it's like to be a feminist icon, and I find it to be very amusing because I don't even know what that means. But I also like to say that I want to get a hat with rhinestones that says feminist icon. So I was a feminist long before I knew what the word meant. I didn't read feminist books. I simply watched the world, and I listened to stories, and I read stories. I knew that the world did not give to women the same dignity that it gave to men. I was aware of how much the socialization of women was focused on men. Don't wear a miniskirt, or you'll be raped by a man. Learn to cook and clean so that you can keep a man. Don't be too ambitious so you don't intimidate a man. Don't always say what you really think, and learn to pretend so as to protect a man's ego. And on the other hand, I realized how little of the socialization of men was about women. When I was growing up, I don't remember boys being told to do things or not to do things in order to please girls. Mine is a feminism rooted in stories, in a kind of practicality, in a textured observation of the real lives of women and men. For me, it is a belief system, and it is quite a simple one. Men and women are equal, which they are, in human dignity and human worth. It is not that men and women are the same, because it is in fact the very fact of their difference that caused sexism in the first place. It is the differences between men and women that make feminism necessary in the first place. And the differences really are that men in general were physically stronger than women, and that women's bodies did the long-term labor of reproduction, and both created disadvantages for women. And at the beginning of human civilization, a time that prized strength, this of course meant that women couldn't possibly be the powerful group. We no longer live in that time, but we are products of our history. And if we have lived for centuries in a certain way, with certain belief systems, then the dismantling of those belief systems will require time and effort. I consider myself a student of life and a student for life. And so feminism for me is a journey of learning and unlearning, and it is an ongoing journey. A few years ago, I was at an event in Soweto in South Africa, and a woman asked me a question which I consider one of the best questions I've ever been asked publicly. She said to me, you are known now for making feminism fashionable and cool, and you talk a lot about femininity and feminism not being mutually exclusive, and you've opened it up to women who before would not have claimed themselves as feminists, women who like lip gloss and high heels. And then she said, well, what about women like me? What about women like me who, for so long, took feminism as our refuge? Women like me who, and the word she used was, women like me who are ugly and fat. She was not ugly. And she said, what about us? We now feel as though feminism has become about other things rather than us. And her question really made me stop and think. And it made me think about how sometimes in opening new doors, we can also inadvertently be closing other doors. And it made me decide to be very careful about being very clear that the point is about a broad range of possibilities for women. And so I like to use two dear friends of mine in Lagos as examples, my friend Chioma and my friend Yewande, who are both brilliant, thoughtful, lovely feminist women. But Chioma cannot leave her home without a full face of makeup, and Yewande has absolutely no time for makeup. And for me, they both represent what the ideal is. And so this woman's question from South Africa really, I think, for me, became about questioning how we go about the project of inclusivity. That I realized that in some ways that I was guilty of not realizing that it is in fact possible in the name of inclusivity to inadvertently close the door. I used to feel uncomfortable about talking about the differences between men and women. I felt that because these differences were the roots of female oppression, that it was better not to talk about them. It was better to talk about the fact that people are different more than men and women are different, which is true and which I still believe. But I think we can talk about both. And more importantly, I think that if two groups are not equal, the answer is not to pretend that they are and to then treat them as though that they were. The answer is to actually make them equal. We cannot wish away the real effects of a woman's body on her life's choices and on her life's options. We need only to look, for example, at what is happening today in Texas, in the United States, where a woman's right to autonomy of her body is now in serious peril. I also used to worry about talking too much about the real effects of female socialization, because I thought it might come across as blaming the victim. But we cannot diagnose a problem fully if we tell only half the story of the problem. So this past April, for example, I remember reading about the European Commission president, whose name I will not pronounce because I think I will not do it justice, but it's Ursula, can I get help? Von der Leyen, thank you. And the meeting that she had with the Turkish president and the European Union Council president. And at that meeting, both men were giving chairs and she wasn't giving a chair. And so she stood there awkwardly for a bit, and then she sat on the sofa. And before she did that, the way that she showed her discontent was simply to make a small sound, ahem. And later she wrote, I am the president of the European Commission, and this is how I expected to be treated on my visit to Turkey as the president of the European Commission. So now a German woman was telling me how she and her friends were very disappointed that, that Madame Ursula von der Leyen did not speak up at that moment, and that she only made that sound, ahem. But I was pleased when this German woman also added that she was not sure what she would have done in the same situation, whether she would have had the courage to ask for a chair. And so when we think about issues of this sort, it is not only about female socialization, but also about the expectations that the world has on women. We must recognize that it is a difficult thing to raise a woman in a world that tells her not to show anger, that penalizes her for showing anger, and then suddenly, overnight, demands that she show her anger. The burden of fixing what is broken should not only be on women. Men must share this burden. It is a journey to justice, and it must be shared. I know, for example, that I probably would have demanded a chair. But I also know that many women, not all women, we're all raised differently. We all have our different strengths and our weaknesses. But the larger point is that we live in a world that makes it difficult for women to show negative emotion publicly, because it's very easy to be labeled a bitch. So I want to briefly talk about the role of men. She was at a meeting with a man who was the European Union Council president, and he sat on the chair. She didn't have a chair. He shouldn't have sat on that chair. He should have said she needs a chair. And here's why. Because the world is male-dominated and male-appeasing. And so men have to be part of remaking this world. In meetings, when a woman is talking and a man interrupts, another man should step up and say, shut up. Because we live in a world in which men listen to men. Because men have such power, for example, in hiring women to positions on boards, we will never reach true equality if men are not part of the justice movement for equality. And here's an example that's very common in Nigeria. You walk into a restaurant with a man, and the waiter comes up, and the waiter greets the man and ignores you. And then often, when you then make a fuss, people turn to you and say, why are you making a fuss? And often the man who's asking you why you're making a fuss himself has enjoyed being greeted and acknowledged. And so it becomes the woman who has to explain why she wants to be acknowledged in the way that human beings want to be acknowledged. And so when I say that women are not allowed to get angry, of course women get angry every day. So what do I mean? I mean that women know that there are potential consequences for being angry publicly, and that the knowledge of these potential consequences silences them. If you know you're going to be called a bitch if you express your anger, you quickly learn to censor yourself because you realize that to be labeled has very grave consequences, and one of those consequences is making it almost impossible for you even to be heard. So often we ask women, how is anger useful? And with women, we speak endlessly of backlash. But we respect male anger, even when it is unfounded. And you can look at the literature of what they call incels in the US to understand what it is about excusing male anger that is utterly unfounded. And so today it has become fashionable to tell women to push back. And I agree with this wholeheartedly. We should teach women and encourage women to push back. But we must also, while we do that, we must also understand that we should put as much of an effort into remaking the world so that when women do push back, they're not judged differently. I have American women friends who tell me that men in their workplace get promotions by acting a certain way. But when they do, when women act the same way, they get performance managed. And they're told that they're too pushy, too confrontational, too presumptuous. And so often for the same behavior, a man is called confident, a woman is called arrogant. A man is called uncompromising, a woman is called a ball breaker. A man is called assertive, a woman is called aggressive. A man is strategic, a woman is manipulative. A man is a leader, a woman is controlling. A man is authoritative, a woman is annoying. And so female socialization matters, and we must talk about it. And female socialization, what I've found is that while there are differences all over the world, there are really major similarities that cut across culture, race, class. One of which is likability, that all over the world, girls are raised to think of likability as something essential for them, that they should be liked. And I think that all human beings like to be liked. I think it's lovely to be liked. But for girls and women, they're often taught this insidious need to be liked. And that often then becomes dangerous for them when they're dealing with situations that are harmful to them. There's so many girls who cannot speak out about being victims of sexual assault because they want to be nice, because they want to be liked. I find also that cutting across culture and race and class is that girls and women and girls are raised to pretend to be less intelligent than they are, to reduce themselves. And often the reason for this is the management of the male ego. Also, I've observed that they often are taught to apologize for occupying their God-given space in the world. And most of all, they know that doing these things, often the world rewards them, and not doing them, the world censures them. These things matter, and these things must change. I remember once doing an event in Lagos, and when it was time for Q&A, a very eager young man stood up at the back and said, "I used to like you when you were just a writer, but when you started talking about feminism and gay people, I no longer liked you." And what I thought was, has it occurred to you whether I like you? And whether I want you to like me? It is important for me to be a subject and not an object in the sentence of my life. Too often, women and girls are made to feel themselves only as objects in the sentences of their lives. I think it is all well and good to tell girls that somebody doesn't like them or that somebody likes them, but I think it's just as important to tell them that they also have the power to like and dislike. I personally very jealously guard my own ability and my own power to like and dislike. And this is what I believe we should teach more girls today. And this also reminds me of a story that I just read about Angela Merkel, a woman I admire very much, who I was very excited to meet 2 days ago. And So apparently one of the early meetings that Angela Merkel had with Vladimir Putin, he had done his research on her and discovered that she did not like dogs because she'd been bitten by a dog when she was a little girl, and so she was afraid of dogs. And so when she arrives for the meeting and she gets seated, the first thing he does promptly is open the door and let the dogs out. And Chancellor Merkel sits there pretending that she's not terrified of the dogs. And I read this and I remember just feeling this rage on her behalf. And also thinking, why didn't she just say, get these dogs out of the room? And a man with whom I had this conversation said, well, she wanted to show him that she was not afraid. And I understand that, but I think what made me sad about that story is that she wanted to show him that she was not afraid, but she was doing that on his own terms. And it made me think about how, very often, women do not even get to show their strength on their own terms. So March 8th, which is International Women's Day, is a day on which I get many invitations to come speak about the glories of women in different parts of the world, and I nearly always say no, because I have very mixed feelings about that day. Even just the idea of an International Women's Day. I want us to get to a point in the world where we don't need it. But anyway, it's a day on which often there are quotes from people in power, overwhelmingly men, quotes about women. And I'm struck by how these quotes are invariably about how wonderful women are, how women are peacemakers, how women are virtuous. The premise of most of these quotes is often that women are morally better than men. And I do not subscribe to this view at all. Women are not special. Women are just human. The danger of this thinking, that women are special, is that if women are seen as somehow special or somehow morally better than men, then it justifies their being held to a higher and more unfair standard. And it also keeps the standard too low for men. Some years ago, there was a Nigerian politician called Patricia Ete, and she had done what most Nigerian politicians do, which is steal public money. And the news was made public, and there was stories about how much she had stolen, and I was so struck by the vitriol that followed this, the publication of her thefts. But most of all, what struck me was how often people would say, but how could she steal so much? She's a woman. Studies show us that voters expect virtuous behavior from female candidates, and even more interesting is that female voters in particular expect virtuous behavior more from female candidates than from men. For them, women must meet higher and far more moralistic standards of behavior than any man. It's the problem of Caesar's wife. She must always be seen as above even the shadow of suspicion. And so this inherently virtuous view of women is very dangerous for women, especially in the criminal justice system, because it often affects how rape trials are conducted. When rape trials become not about the evil of rape, but about how good or virtuous the woman was. I think this view of women also complicated the Me Too movement and the way that the Me Too movement was covered. The undertone to much of the coverage, especially in the US, which is an area I know well, was that we need women to be good before we consider them worthy of justice or sympathy. So examples are stories in which we're told that, many stories in ways women's agency are removed from them. So she went up to his hotel room to get a glass of water, and then he locks the door and assaults her. And for me, I would often be troubled by this because I would think, well, why can't it be? She went up to his hotel room thinking, something might happen, maybe, maybe not, I'll see, he's kind of cute. And she gets up there and she thinks, actually, he's not that cute. And then he locks the door and assaults her. The difference in the two stories is that in the first one, we've stripped her of all agency. We've created a kind of sort of innocent sprite. And that's the only way it seems to me that we think we can have sympathy for her. So my point is, Women should be allowed to be human. They should be allowed to be difficult and imperfect and complicated and still be deserving of justice and sympathy. The Me Too movement inspired me very much because it was a storytelling movement. It seems to me that never before in the West had women's stories been told and heard in the way that happened during the Me Too movement. And I was also struck by how often men were surprised by the stories. And I have to say how some men were changed by them. I have friends, good men who, believe in equality, at least ostensibly, who were just shocked by the stories and who often said, really? That actually happens? And I remember one man saying to me, but not that often, right? And I said, actually, very often. I don't know any woman who I know personally and know well enough to have these conversations with who doesn't have one story, at least one story, of sexual assault or potential sexual assault by a man. I think the Me Too movement also, for me, highlighted how we must change how we think about and talk about women's sexuality. There's too much shame attached to women as the idea of women as sexual beings. And we also need to talk about how women silence themselves because of the stigma of shame. How people silence women because of the stigma of shame. How even the conversation about consent is tainted by the stigma of shame. In many Western cultures, the US, Western Europe, women are expected to be sexy, but not really sexual. Otherwise, what is the point of that word, slut? What is the male equivalent of slut? There isn't one. And so that word slut is not really a criticism of being promiscuous. It is a criticism of women being sexual beings. Because if it were about being promiscuous, then we would have the equivalent for men. And so it is important to see how global this impulse to control women's bodies is. It might be more dramatic in places like Afghanistan, where women who do not want to cover themselves are forced to do so. And I make a distinction here between women who do not want to cover themselves and women who do, because there are, in fact, all over the world, intelligent, independent women who choose to be observant Muslims, and I respect that. But the impulse to control women's bodies is a global impulse. There are places where young girls are still brutally, horribly, evilly cut in the name of female circumcision. But it's the same impulse that leads towards like slut. And by the way, speaking of sort of global, the global oppression of women, it's also interesting to me how I think that sexism is something that is global, of course, but the manifestations are different. And I was thinking recently about how age is so interesting in the way that it intersects with sexism. So in the US, I think women in general become more invisible as they get older because American culture worships youth. And so there is a kind of shallow power that comes to women when they're younger. And as they get older, they become more invisible. In Nigeria, which is a culture that really doesn't worship youth that much, and in fact reveres age and respects age, women are more likely to gain a bit more respect the older they get. Neither is ideal. I once spoke about my relationship to a word that is used very often in liberal circles, and that word is privilege. I spoke about being Black and being a woman, two groups that are not really privileged in the world. But I also spoke about having class privilege, which is a consequence of having been born into a relatively privileged academic family in Nigeria and having a good education. I spoke about how I often have class guilt, how I'm acutely aware of the things I enjoy that I have not really earned, things that come to me because of the accident of my birth. And I spoke finally about how I still enjoy these perks and privileges, even if guiltily. A friend of mine who was an academic, an American academic, was horrified. A dear, lovely woman, but she said, "How can you say that you enjoy your privilege?" And I said, "Because I do." And I think it's important to be honest about these things, and it helps in the difficult and important conversations about not so much dismantling privilege. I prefer to use the expression democratizing privilege. This academic woman's question betrays, I think, a certain longing for a kind of perfection. We know that humans are not perfect by the very virtue of being human, and yet we demand perfection of people. As a storyteller, I do not trade in perfection. I cannot trade in perfection. I do not trust perfection. I do not believe in perfection. If humans were perfect, stories would not exist, because it is our flaws and our imperfections that lend texture to the stories we tell. And so, on this subject of perfection and imperfection, I've been thinking a lot about women and the standards that they're held to. So that all of this talk about teach your sons to respect women, I think that's lovely, but I think we need to make it a bit more nuanced and make it clear that it's respect not as ornaments on a pedestal to be revered, but simply as full and equal human beings. It also makes me think of the mixed messages that we seem to give girls in the world today. So, in theory, when we say to them, stand up for yourself, speak up, push back, but actually, the same people who say that to girls and women will turn around and censure those girls and women when they do speak up and stand up. So it's supposed also to be a thing that we say to girls, you must love yourself. But often girls who really love themselves get some hate. The world is full of men and women who dislike a woman solely because that woman does not dislike herself. So if you're telling a girl to love herself, and if you're telling her girl power and whatnot, you also have to look inward and be honest and make sure that you will not turn around and try to cut her down when she does thrive. We often expect that women must be perfect and flawless before they get sympathy. But even that perfection and flawlessness can backfire and become a reason for them to lose sympathy. And I should say that I'm sometimes ambivalent about the idea of the sisterhood. Because despite my great love for women, the idea of a sisterhood sometimes assumes that we must all agree with each other because we are women. And that would be a terrible and boring world. There are many women with whom I strongly disagree. But I think the point I am trying to make is not so much that sisterhood should be that we always support women because they're women, or we always agree with women because they're women, but that we question where our disagreements are coming from, that we try to make sure that we're disagreeing with her based on her ideas, not because she's a woman. And so in conclusion, storytelling for me is even more important because of the power of symbolism. Symbols really matter. We need more women in positions of power, obviously because women make up half the world, but also because representation matters, because perception matters, and because perception really does shape reality. I think, for example, that the fact of Angela Merkel's existence means that there's so many little girls all over the world, not just in Europe, for whom she represents what is possible. And that matters. So her presence alone creates hope. And there is nothing more essential to the human spirit than hope. Symbols can also give us courage to act. And I actually believe that both are intertwined, courage and hope. I think hope is an act of courage. And I think that courage is born of hope. I really do believe that we can recreate this world. I believe it very, very strongly. I think that by doing, by being, we carve out a small space, we shape it and we reshape it, and so in that way, small slice by small slice. We walk slowly, yes, but we walk on the path of progress. Thank you.
Hello? Okay. First of all, Chimamanda, let me start by saying how deeply moved I was by your talk. And I quoted in my opening, we should all be feminists, where you state that anger has a long history of bringing about positive change. Yeah. And so I truly agree with you. We need anger to shake off a political slumber and to care and be aware. So your speech was both poetic and political and provided examples of the radical transformations feminist discourse implies. So we will now move to the Q&A session. Since we are still dealing with COVID, we cannot allow for open Q&A. So I welcome now the 7 students who will address questions to you. So allow me to introduce them. 2 of them are GRÓ-GEST fellows, postgraduate students at the University of Iceland, International Gender Studies and Training Program, Evelyn Kelvera from Kenya, and Tatiana Margarita Teles Calderon from Mexico. They're sitting there.
Oh, I thought I was a bit confused. Hello.
Ragnhildur Helgadóttir and Snædís Björnsdóttir are BA students in comparative literature. And Margrét Erla Þórsdóttir is a BA student in philosophy. And finally, 2 PhD students in history, Pontus Jarstedt and Tryggvi Rúnar Brynjarsson. So please go ahead, introduce yourselves, and remember to keep your questions concise and to the point. So we'll start by this end.
I'd like to thank you for an enlightening talk. My name is Ragnhildur. I was wondering if you have a certain goal or goals in mind while crafting a story. Is it your aim to influence your readers in a particular way, or does your writing simply result from your inner need to write?
It actually usually depends on what I'm writing. So when I'm writing, my love is fiction, but I also write non-fiction. When I write fiction, I don't know what I'm doing. It's the thing that makes me happiest in the whole world when it's going well. It's almost magical. It's like being transported, and it's like, briefly becoming God. I'm creating these worlds, and I'm lost in them, and it's just the most magical thing. And so because the process is not entirely conscious for me, I have a sense, I start a story, I have a sense of what I want to do. Sometimes the characters just do things that I didn't plan for them to do. So I never know what I'm doing with fiction. But non-fiction, I'm always very clear about what my goal is and what I'm hoping to achieve with the piece of non-fiction. So non-fiction is an entirely different thing for me. It's not magical. It's not magical, but necessary sometimes.
Yes, my name is Snædís, and I'm a BA student in comparative literature. My question also regards fiction and non-fiction. So you write both fiction and non-fiction, and of course have a great talent for both. What's the difference between writing fiction and non-fiction for you? Perhaps this has already been answered, but what do you believe to be the difference in the reception of fiction and non-fiction, and the difference in what can be achieved with the two different types of writing?
It's actually an interesting question, the second part about the reception. I think we read both with different eyes. And actually I once wrote a little rant about how I think we should read fiction with the eyes of non-fiction and the reverse. I think when we come to a piece of writing knowing what it's supposed to be, in other words, when we read fiction knowing it's fiction, we receive it in a different way, which is why often it becomes a valid response to a piece of fiction to say, I don't believe this story. Right? But if the exact same story were written with a label non-fiction on it, the option of not believing is taken away from us because it comes with this pre-labeled idea that it happened, therefore it is true. And I guess because fiction is my true love, I feel very resentful about this. And so, it's really interesting to think about. I think that we maybe give to nonfiction, particularly now in our world today, a bit more, a bit more, not so much aesthetic value, because that we reserve for fiction, but I think a kind of a willingness to believe nonfiction in a way that we don't necessarily give fiction. And I think we should just not do that, because fiction is queen. But what was the last, there was a third part to it. Oh, what it can achieve. Yes. As a person who reads both, I think both have power. And I also think, I should say that nonfiction is also art, can be art. I think both have the power of creating empathy, of being the catalyst for us to act on certain things, of enlightening us. I really just think that reading either fiction or nonfiction, but the nonfiction has to be done well, she says, with the arrogance of the fiction writer. I think both can have a certain kind of, they can achieve, they can do a lot, can change the world, potentially.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Margaret. I'm a philosophy student. I prepared a question about feminism in general, and it's maybe kind of long and dramatic, but I believe in the power of terms, and I remember feeling extremely powerful at 13 when I began labeling myself as a feminist. To me, it meant I had a word for the frustration I felt in everyday life and a plan for action. I was certain being a feminist meant having loud arguments with my male classmates who refused to call themselves feminists even though they believed in equal rights. I thought the solution to gender inequality was making people realize there was a problem with our society, with our culture, and that the solution would be brought about when everyone could label themselves as feminists. In Iceland, we've made a lot of progress, so much that I'd say it's easy to be a feminist today. Or at least to label yourself one. However, as we've seen with Me Too and experienced multiple times in everyday life, in particular with regards to gender and sexual violence, we've not attained gender equality. The term feminist has a radical unifying strength, but we've also seen it become commercialized in recent years. So my question is this: how do we maintain the integrity of the term when labeling ourselves a feminist may be easier than the alternative?
I'm sorry, can you just the last sentence?
Yeah, sorry. How do we maintain the integrity of being a feminist when labeling yourself a feminist may be easier than the alternative, not labeling yourself a feminist?
Really? Do you really think labeling yourself a feminist is easier than the alternative of not labeling yourself a feminist?
I think sometimes it's my experience in Iceland, at least.
Huh. Iceland seems very advanced. I think really, because I'm actually curious about how that what it's like in Iceland so do women, I can tell you, for example, that, I mean, like that eager young man in Lagos said to me, until you started talking about feminism, I liked you. So I think that while it is true that we must acknowledge there is a kind of new hipness and an ever so slight cool factor to that idea of feminism, I suppose thanks to Beyonce, who quoted somebody in her song, right? But I also think that, I sometimes think that we overemphasize this cool factor. I mean, there's still a lot of just real resistance to the idea of women having just being equal human beings. There's still a very strong all over the world. And we still have governments. I mean, look at what's called populism sweeping across Europe. And of course, we cannot talk about just the disaster of Afghanistan. But I guess my point is that, and I'm going to ask whether in Iceland, it is it really, so if you're a young woman and you call yourself a feminist, there isn't backlash?
At least not in my experience, but I think it's changed a lot in recent years. And I think it's just been, I hear people talk about, like, when someone says they're not a feminist, that's not the norm, and that's something you would gossip about. Like the guy in your class who doesn't label himself a feminist, and it's kind of strange to hear.
But of course, you know, there is always a difference between labeling oneself something and actually standing up for the things that that label counts for. I mean, but your question about integrity, I mean, my feeling is, and concerns about sort of the commercialization of that term, which I hear, but often for me, because I'm very keen on this idea of democratizing the idea of feminism, I sometimes think that maybe commercializing it, and again, we can even talk about what we mean. There are young people today who had never heard that word feminist until they listened to Beyonce's song. And suddenly they're like, oh, what does it mean? And just like a young woman said to me once, she said, and then I looked it up and then I said, oh, that's what I am. That's the word for all those things that annoy me that my brothers do. And I think that there's a sense in which it's important not to think that feminism has to be this sort of esoteric little school that you get into if you can quote Judith Butler, you know? I think that there's a sense in which, for me, the women who inspired me were the market women who, in Nsukka, where I grew up, who do not read, who cannot read, who are not literate. But their lives, the texture of their lives, how I saw them striving, they were in abusive marriages and they often would have the courage to get up and go and start their little businesses to support their children, and they would have these little groups where they would talk and make fun of their abusive husbands. They inspired me. Those were feminists. And I guess my point is, that's what I look to, a kind of democratizing of an idea. And maybe for me also the question is, if you don't call yourself a feminist, and if you're not a feminist, what are you? Seriously.
Thank you so much. We will move to the next table. Evelyn and Tatiana, if you would start.
Me?
No, Evelyn and Tatiana, please.
Thank you. You have shared with us about stories within the context of joy and agency and truth. So in that story, I can just help but ask, who owns the stories? And if the stories are a tool of agency, what does that mean, for example, for your voice to be that of the community and not personal? What is the impact on that and agency? Who owns the stories?
I'm so sorry. I didn't hear the first part of the question. I think it might be the mask.
Yeah, absolutely. The first part was just about you talking to us about stories within the context of joy and agency and truth. And within that context, I can just help but ask, who owns the stories? And what does that mean as a woman when your story is no longer your own, but of the community?
When your story is no longer owned by you?
Yeah.
But by the community?
By the community, for example.
Oh, I see what you mean. You mean when you tell your story, then it's no longer yours?
Yes.
Yeah, but actually it's still kind of yours. But in some ways, I think it's similar to writing a book and you send it out into the world, and you cannot control the way that your story will be interpreted because you've sent it out into the world. But it doesn't make it any less of your story because it came from you. But I think maybe the larger point is we should share stories. I think that the whole point of human civilization is this is what we've done since we've been here. We've shared stories. And in some ways, it is what makes us human. In other words, we're human because we're part of this human family. And how do we keep connected as a human family? It's true. We tell stories. And so, yeah, I mean, I suppose my point is it necessarily a concern if your story were owned both by you and by the community?
Yes, but also, for example, there is a production of stories and a system of power within that production. So also that affects how you share that story. There will be people who will not have access, for example, to a global forum.
So that's a different, okay, right. Which in some ways, I think, when I gave the talk, The Danger of a Single Story, for me, really, it was about how important it is to think about storytelling as being part of a system of power. And that the stories we tell, who hears them, who gets to tell them, who, of course, it's about power. And so and even talking about women's stories. So for example, we know that, and we know this objectively because studies have shown that men read men and women read men and women in terms of literature. I mean, apparently Iceland is this haven of equality, but I'm guessing it's also true here. And for me, it's a very sort of clear example of power, that you talk to women and you say, who have you read in the past 6 months? And they give you a list of men and women. And you ask men, who have you read? And they just give you a bunch of men that they've read. And I think for me, then it becomes a problem that it's something that I think some publishers are becoming more conscious of it and more conscious of how they market women's stories, because that's also part of it. My dear friend Binyavanga Wainaina once said to me, he said, we were looking at possible covers for one of my new books, and one was pink, and he said to me, no. Tell your publishers, no, not that pink cover, because men will not buy it. And so I think even the way that stories are marketed, that men's stories are often marketed as universal stories for everyone to read, and women's stories are marketed as women's stories for women to read, that in itself is a consequence of power. And obviously when we talk about race, that is even in some ways worse, because there's an assumption that when a white man writes a book, it's a book that's for everyone. When a black woman writes a book, it's a book for black people. Right? And which obviously is bad for all of us, because it means then that we're limiting our access to the wealth and richness and beauty of our world, you know. But yes, so anyway, your point is taken, which is, and I don't know the answer to your question, actually. So that was the whole point of the rambling.
Thank you.
Yes, hello, Chimamanda.
Hello.
In your conversation 2 days ago with Angela Merkel, I think you asked her what she plans to do after her term is over and she's well into what we'd call retirement. And she said that she'd do nothing, essentially, and wait for what would come. But I also think that it's because in some ways, according to the patriarchal society that we've lived in, she has sort of earned her right to rest and her right to not be productive in the way that we understand productivity, and her right to wing it and wait for what will happen. Your friends Chioma and Jowande have the freedom to also choose in certain ways how they will construct their joy, how they will seek for joy in the same way that Angela Merkel is seeking for the joy of laziness, essentially, or the joy of retirement and waiting for things. But in many parts of Africa, women do not have that freedom, and don't have the freedom to rest, don't have the freedom to not do anything and wait because they are being depended on by other people. So my question to you is, in which ways do you think, or have you seen people create joy, or how can we create joy in places where even freedom is not possible?
In places where freedom is not possible?
Yeah. Because you live in a society where the freedom to maybe walk away from your family is not possible, whether you want to be a family woman or not. So how do we create joy when we live in that sort of construct?
Yes, but I actually think, from observing, so I can tell you about women in my ancestral hometown, for example. The reason I say this is that while it's important to talk about it, let us also not take from those who have structural, sort of structural problems cast on them for no sort of fault of theirs. Let us also not take from them that human ability to create joy. So it's sort of like going to a friend of mine who went to Congo during the war, during one of the many unrests and things in Congo, and he came back and said, I cannot believe that the women there in the middle of the war were asking me to give them lipstick. And I was annoyed with him for being so shocked, because he thought, it's like it's terrible, things are terrible there, and they wanted lipstick. And I said, yes, because they're human beings, and we all have the parts of us that are wonderfully frivolous and find joy in things of that sort and want them to. So I think, obviously, I think that women in deprived parts of our continent, I was going to say it's not just Africa that's deprived, but anyway, are finding joy. But maybe for me, what matters more is how can we find ways to make sure that women are, I don't like that word empowered. It's a word that's just so overused that I really do not like to use it, because it's just, but what I mean is that women are given the tools they need. I was thinking recently about a project that gives women in, I forget where, somewhere in Southern Africa, gives them access to condoms, and gives them condoms because of the rise of so apparently the husbands are giving them HIV/AIDS. And so this NGO then starts to distribute condoms. But actually, that didn't work, because what the women needed wasn't condom, because the men would be like, are you crazy? Of course I'm not going to use that. What the women needed was actually little loans to start their own businesses, so they would become a bit more independent, so they could say F off to the men. So I guess my point is the two things I believe. I believe that women, even in the most dire poverty, find ways to make joy, because that is a human thing. But I also think that in talking about feminism, obviously class is such a major part of it. And the acknowledgement and recognition that there are women who do not have the choice of walking away. And by the way, I should say that I don't think Angela Merkel saying that she'll see what happens is laziness. I think she has earned a bit of rest. Yeah. I also think that my friends Choma and Yewande, just because they happen to now be at a point in their lives, we don't know, I can tell you their backstories, and the backstories that involve a lot of grit. So my point is, there are women who we might, I guess my point is, I don't think we should be too quick to dismiss women who have managed to overcome obstacles and get to a certain place. Again, I'm wondering whether we're going back to that thing where we're being a bit too harsh in our judgment of women. Are we?
I do think so. The Angela Merkel for me was, I feel people might be less judgmental towards her because they feel that she has worked hard enough, you know? They feel that she has earned her right to rest, which she has. But then it also comes only after you have put yourself out there, and she has been the subject of a lot of criticism and a lot of patriarchal and sexist comments towards her. And that's after going through all that, now people are like, okay, then she's earned the right to rest.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I also don't know the answer to your question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Where, you know, Kenya is my second adopted country. Where are you from?
I am from Nairobi in Kenya, yes.
I love Nairobi.
You're welcome. It's a wonderful city. I'm really missing it because the weather there is like so much better. I mean, the weather here is interesting, but the weather back home is so much better.
Kali, thank you. And Pontus, it's your turn.
Okay. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I have a question about, you were talking about representation, and I think it's so interesting because we are talking so much in politics today about we need representation in all spheres of life. And I'm really interested also in the way you put it, that we always expect more from women. And I was thinking about this then when it comes to representation in like higher spheres of power, power structures. Last year we had a Me Too conference here in Reykjavík where Angela Davis spoke, and she spoke about how the major military companies in the US now have women CEOs. And I was also thinking about the new World Trade, the World Trade Organization has a new head now who's from Nigeria, your country.
She's my auntie.
Okay, Ngozi Adichie, I hope I pronounced it right. And I'm thinking about the history of the WTO, how it's been pushing neo-colonial policies on the global south. And I'm thinking of these things. And also, another example that I think is very illustrating is when Barack Obama became president, immediately afterwards he was given the Nobel Peace Prize. And then he's continued all his wars around the world. So my question for you is that I recognize the immense importance of representation, but is there also a danger with it? Is there limitations to that? Is there a danger of having representation for the sake of representation, where we don't look at the hierarchy of power, but we instead try to make the hierarchy of power more diverse?
I think we can have both. So in other words, I don't think that... So I don't think, for example, and I should start by saying that I always have a bit of a worry when these examples are brought up, because it seems to me that the premise to these ideas is that if you're a person, a member of a minority group, then you cannot possibly, then somehow you have to, there's a kind of purity demanded of you in a way that I find worrying. So American presidents, as a matter of course, meddle in the world and start wars. That's what American presidents do. That's what they've done. Barack Obama became an American president. He did what American presidents do. My question is, when we then start saying, well, look what he did, are we judging him on the basis of being an American president, or on the basis of you must be pure because you're a black man and we let you into the room? So that kind of worries me. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's, she's joined this organization that, she's leading this organization that has a history that's steeped in ideas that I may not personally believe in, but that she may. She's actually a very interesting woman and a very intelligent woman. And the reason I'm excited that she's there is that I believe that she's going to push the boundaries. But I also think that we have to be realistic, that this is an organization that's existed for so long, and that we cannot then expect magic to happen overnight. And so for me, I'm excited that she's there because she's going to push the boundaries a bit. She's going to, I'm hoping, obviously I cannot speak for her, but she's going to recognize the humanity of Africans. She's going to recognize that we cannot impose ridiculous austerity rules on countries that cannot afford them because people are not eating, right? In a way that, and because I think that she knows that continent. And so I think representation matters because of things like that. She's going to look at the figures, and to her, it's not just going to be empty figures. It's going to be the little girl in Delta State in Nigeria. It's going to be the woman in Kano who wants something better for her family. So it's going to be human beings because she knows them. And hopefully it's going to change the way that some things are done. But to your question about representation for representation's sake, I think that that matters. I do think that representation for representation's sake matters. I think that there are little girls today who may not entirely, who will be inspired by Angela Merkel, for example, who may not entirely agree with her political positions, who will grow up to think of themselves as possibly becoming chancellor, and who, in fact, because of Angela Merkel, will become chancellor and will do better than she did. So, yes. So I suppose the question is, I think that, yes, representation for representation's sake matters, but that's not the only thing, and we cannot think of it as either or. I think we can think of it as both.
Thank you very much.
Hi.
Hello.
I am Tryggvi Rúnar Brynjarsson. It's I think, a Nigerian level difficulty name for English speakers. Not long ago, you noted that there was a privilege in distance when it comes to creativity, and I've been thinking about this a lot. You said this about a book, Half of a Yellow Sun, which is, about a subject matter that is, intensely personal and was present in your life and your upbringing. So I was wondering, how does one strike on the question of distance? How does one strike the balance? How did you do it? Do you do it on a topic-to-topic basis? Do you know where I'm going with this? So as a writer and as a person, we need distance to get things done, I guess, in order to sit down and be able to write about something so, horrible. But how do you do it?
I don't know. We do need, but you know what? I think I did have distance. I had distance in the sense of generational distance. I don't think I could have written about Biafra if I had lived Biafra. I don't think that I would have had, right, like you said, the distance that creativity requires. It would have been too close for me. But there are people, Chinua Achebe wrote short stories about Biafra. But I remember reading somewhere where he said he couldn't possibly write a novel about Biafra because it would just be too much, because he lived it. I didn't, my parents did. And so I had that kind of generational distance from the story, while also, but I think I needed both the distance and the intimacy of it. There was an intimacy for me because I felt myself, having grown up in the shadow of this war, having had that war be present my whole life without really understanding it. And so it was both close and distant. And I think I needed both. The distance was obviously not having lived it. And so when I would talk to my parents endlessly about that period or look at photographs from Biafra, it felt far away, but also I would just spend time just weeping because I'm thinking, my goodness, these are my relatives. Mm-hmm. These children who the world saw as kwashiorkor victims with their red hair and their swollen bellies were related to me. And then I would look at pictures of refugee camps and think, my grandfather died in one of these and he was buried in a mass grave. But at the same time, the pictures would feel a bit distant. So I feel as though I needed both. And so I had my father telling me all of the stories about his experiences, after which I would then kind of step back and turn those stories into fiction. So everything in that novel came from something real. But I then kind of did a kind of imaginative, I don't know, infusing of things into it. And I think I just kind of went day to day hoping that I knew what the hell I was doing.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you all for excellent questions. And thank you
for your questions. Both those I knew answers to and those I did not. Thank you, they were very thoughtful.
And thank you, Chimamanda, for your thoughtful, delightful answers. As a final injunction, I would like to restate your call for all of us to read, since this is the literary festival. Or as you said in your conversation with Angela Merkel earlier this week, I quote, "People need to read more, and not only text messages and tweets, but something that is continuously long and makes sense, that is punctuated and has good grammar."